Hi all, let's have a look at another amazing game from round 2 of the World Chess Championship candidates. Vladimir Kramnik was playing Sergey Karjakin, and he kicked off with d4, and Sergey chose actually d5, and actually the Queen's Gambit accepted, which is a little bit rarer than playing c6 and e6. Still quite popular, especially overall through history. It's been frequently played. The Queen's Gambit accepted. And Vladimir chooses now, instead of knight f3, which I think is the most frequent move, he plays e4, and Sergey plays knight f6. So it's a kind of provocation, a little bit like an Alekhine defense, provoking white's pawns forward. So black gets that d5 square, knight d5. After bishop takes c4, a little bit again like the Alekhine's defense. It looks as though this could have arisen from the Alekhine's defense, in fact, this position. Now here, Vladimir chooses bishop d3, often played as also bishop b3. This pawn can't be taken because of bishop b5 check. If the knight's pinned, just queen takes d4. So bishop d3 is a viable alternative. Black puts more pressure now immediately on the d4 pawn by playing knight c6. And this is simply protected. And here, knight b4, this is all been seen before, quite frequently played. And the move here for white to play is bishop e4. This is theoretically the move most played. Let's actually put on a Kbitsa just out of interest to see. You might think other moves are okay. I think bishop e2, there's bishop f5. That's a big problem. So I think there's a very specific reason to keep that diagonal in order so you play bishop e4 there, very specific, against bishop f5, for example. Okay, so here theoretically f5 is played most often. That is played here. Now usually this is the interesting part. Theoretically, in live book, 93 games with e takes f6 en passant. And this is very new now, what Vladimir played. He didn't play this e takes f6. He kept his pawn wedge. That pawn on e5 is an interesting pawn wedge to try and maintain. And I have only one reference for this. It might even be this game. I think this might be a new idea in this whole system. Vladimir plays a3. Just to give you a gist of e takes f6, it sometimes continues like this, bishop b1, and this is supposedly about equal, this kind of position. So it's a radical departure here. You'll notice, white's queen side and centre, that at least they're intact. There's 3 pawn islands here for white, but they're fairly, there's no isolated pawn or anything. Now this idea, a3, is really fracturing the queen side quite significantly. In fact, it becomes a gambit. So after f takes e4, note that black's pawns are also split and white has kept the wedge pawn. A takes b4. This is a gambit after e6. How does white actually try and keep the pawn? Well, his intention is to make it a gambit rather. White can actually keep the pawn with b5. But I think black would be fine with bishop b4 check here. And then say knight d5. This is a lot of pressure. There's one other thing I just want to mention though about this. In this position, you might think, is bishop f3 plausible? And this is quite nice to know, just generally, that this knight is actually quite pesky, and as a general rule you try and kick off knights that have reached the 5th rank because they can be quite dangerous, and here it is quite dangerous because of f4. It's a bit annoying. So bishop takes f4, queen takes d4, and that would be really embarrassing. Queen takes d4, black's a little bit better after getting the queen back. So there's only 2 real alternatives, and Vladimir chose one of them, and I find that quite remarkable that this new move kind of exists here. So anyway, f takes e4, a takes b4, e6, and not b5 now, but just gambiting the b4 pawn. So bishop takes b4, and here, if this bishop is going to be given up, black would be weaker on the dark squares, and it's very interesting, this check now, it creates some more dark square weaknesses. So g6, and there's more dark square weaknesses. And you could imagine if this if a knight ever captures on e4 later, then this f6 would be a useful square as well. So this pawn wedge could be useful in the future. But clearly black's use of d5, you might think, should be strong here. Black's got a very comfortable target of attack, this backward d pawn here. So queen g4 is played, not with the immediate idea though of taking on e4, because then something like queen d5 here is strong. White's just playing this for knight ge2 and h4. This will really sway castling kingside in this position. Okay, so Sergey actually voluntarily gives up the bishop. I'm not sure this is, the engines don't actually like this, volunteering the dark square bishop here. There's some other alternatives that might have been interesting, but anyway, let's go with that. So takes, his idea is to use that d5 square, and he's got a blockade on c4. So positioning, it looks as though black's light square strategy is quite good here, and holding on to the pawn a little bit longer. And also now black can persist in holding on the pawn with bishop d7 to c6, which he does. So knight e2, bishop d7. Here white doesn't even bother with knight g3 immediately, just castles. And there is also now the problem of knight f4 though. So bishop c6, I think, just runs into knight f4, and then we can take on e6. So this knight f4 is a bit of a pain. So black actually avoided knight f4 in advance with queen c4. Still, he's got a grip on the d5 square. It doesn't look all bad for black at the moment. It looks fairly balanced for both sides. Knight g3, and now holding on to the pawn, or at least the option to take this knight if it dares take that e pawn. But here, very interestingly, I mean, this is a really dynamic move now. White is not interested in knight takes e4, and why should he be? I don't think it's particularly good, knight takes e4. Black takes this, and then knight d5, and we have a beautiful Nmsivitsian blockade. Nmsivits will be proud. This light square blockade. White would have a sort of dead position with minimal counterplay, potentially. I think any attempt at e6, well, we can just take and then protecting e6. So no, I want to avoid these dead positions like the plague. No, that's not the idea. There's a beautiful idea, which Nmsivits would also approve of, trying to inflict doubled pawns on the opponent in potential variations with rook a5. Not just with the idea of dissuading castling queenside, because the a7 pawn looks like a problem, but there's also rook c5 introduced now as an idea, with an idea of potentially sacrificing the exchange. And in fact, black here is in a difficult spot. If he castles kingside, then h4, this queen is quite dangerously poised just for h4, h5. Although crude as it is, where are black's pieces? They're all over here. How does black actually defend his king here? This is very, very tricky. You know, rook f7, h5, simple, h5. If something like this, bishop h6, and it's just really, really bad. The dark squares are still quite painfully weak as well. So black really doesn't want to castle kingside here. But he's faced with this dilemma. Isn't white going to just take on a7? So he castles queenside anyway, leaving a7 on prise. That's not taken though. That's the beautiful thing. White, who has been a pawn down, you might think, wants to get his pawn back. Rook takes a7 though here might actually leave the rook a little bit trapped after knight a4. With king b8 as now a threat, white has to do something potentially about this. Now, and just rook a8 check. This isn't so great for white. Black still has a nice blockade on the light squares. Also, c3 looks fairly vulnerable, and maybe something like rook c1 b5 and just try and undermine the pawn chain potentially. So that's not really desirable. No, the idea is rook c5 now. This is a very, very nice concept that actually, even here now, after queen b3, the engines, just like the exchange sacrifice, the positional exchange sac, although the engines wouldn't be basing it on intuition but rather a lot of calculation, but here the immediate exchange sac seems very favourable indeed. The key point is the king's here. This knight on c5 isn't just pretty, it's facilitating this kind of stuff to make the black king. So if we look at this, h5, we can even just drop back here or take on g6, but if we drop back here for attacking intention, this is dangerous, this position. But Vladimir didn't go in for this. It will start to get dangerous anyway. If the queen can be evicted and the knight entrenches on c5, it starts to look very, very good for white. Black's any potential counterattack for black has to be factored in, but it starts to look very, very promising. Here it's almost the decisive advantage in this variation now. The knight on c5 is a very permanent attacking resource here. So let's just calm down black's counterplay and then look at what white's going to do. Let's follow this. Maybe even white just sits on this position. This position just looks as though there's certainly enough compensation for the exchange. If black's able not to be mated, it just looks like white's dominating the position. So it looks as though, to me anyway, that the exchange sac immediately is already possible here. The idea of getting a knight to c5 and just freezing up a lot of black's resources to avoid being mated, it just seems very, very tempting here. But the temptation was resisted here for rook takes c6. Vladimir played c4. And he's threatening now, he's blunting the queen here, he's threatening queen takes e6 and then d5 later. So black actually plays king b8. If knight takes c4, that's disaster, that's check and winning the knight. So the king steps out of the way. And yes, that is a pawn to be taken. If black had also just tried to defend, that's hopeless as well, because of d5 we've got that pin on the king. So the king had to really step away. Queen takes e6, rook d e8. And now, this is quite fascinating, and this is, I think, in the post-mortem analysis of the game, Vladimir was saying this is an incredibly complicated position to try and calculate with 5 different candidate moves in all different directions. And he played actually here what looks to be a strange sort of move, queen h3. If we look at more aggressive moving away, trying to keep hold of the c4 pawn and get black's rooks into uncomfortable places. For example, here, if rook hf8, queen takes h7, this could be a bit on the greedy side. Black could actually drum up some counterplay with knight takes c4 and say bishop h6. This gets really scary because that bishop is a target there. Black could actually drum up some counterplay here with for example e3. That liberates the bishop and it offering the exchange, and this shows how dangerous black's position can be. Bishop takes f8, and instead of taking on f8 here, which is no good because of queen g7, and then there's not much, but actually black has knight d2 here, and this is really dangerous with these resources. So if for example bishop h6, knight takes, this is really bad news for white. Here, if rook takes c6, counter sack, I mean it gets very, very hairy. Bishop d6 is the only way to draw now for white, apparently. because if rook e1, then this starts to get nasty for white. d4 is a big problem. The queen's just out of the way, so it's good to avoid this stuff. The queen's just in Siberia here, so forget this. Vladimir just played queen. He avoided all black's counterplay with just queen h3 like this. The queen plays a supportive role along the third rank potentially as well for that bishop on e3. We see knight takes c4, and now the exchange sack. So here, if black flips in knight takes e3, we have that nice pin. That's a nice point here that the knight can't move. Interesting, I think b takes is clearly better for white for knight c5 for the exchange sack idea. In fact, it's not even about taking the knight back here. Rook b1 check, queen d7 is also mating, and that's to be avoided. So that's pretty dangerous stuff. But here, in fact, queen d5 is also another interesting move in this position. But there would be rook c5 hitting the queen, and white should be okay in this position. It's got nice pawns in the centre. But okay, black here didn't play knight takes e3, he just simply took on c6. Knight takes e4, so the knight's heading to c5 with tempo potentially. Knight b6, knight c5 with tempo, queen d5, rook c1 now is played. In fact, the engines really like rook a1 in this position, with the idea of queen g4 to e2, and that a rook would be useful for attacking a7 with the queen. But this move, rook c1, keeps everything fairly intact as well. King a8, which actually maybe is a slight slip up here. Instead of king h8, king a8, if the king is actually protecting c7, there's a kind of weakness of the last move associated with king a8 here. If that's not played, say h5, not trying to move the king. This is still nice for white, but maybe it's an attempt, a legitimate attempt for black to get counterplay to use these pawns, because the king here, the queen staring down at g2. This is looking as though this might have been better for black to try, but it's still technically nice for white. But at least there's a counterplay attempt. This kind of stuff. It's not entirely convincing. The engines don't really think black's crashing through anything. In fact, white's better technically. But there's always queen e2 to a6. Even here, queen e2. So there's not enough time for black's attack, it seems. And now the rook can get on the a file. So, okay, even if king a8 wasn't played, it seems as though black's king is in trouble anyway. But king a8 as played here is a weakness of the last move. c7 is now attacked, threatening to fork the queen and king. King goes back, and now knight b4 gets a pawn for the exchange and knocks out the queen from that nice central post. So not only getting a pawn potentially, but queen's evicted. Here now, though, there are more interesting things to do than actually take on c6, believe it or not. The knight is usefully poised as well for a6, not just taking the pawn. It's got dual functionality here on b4, and in fact there's a very, very concise move which not only stops black's counterplay here, this wasn't played, but emphasizes a6. Very, very concise move in bishop h6 to prevent rook f8 and threaten now things like queen a3 or queen d3 for that use of the knight on b4. With this very, very precise move, it's very, very difficult to see how black would cope with this sort of thing. For example, like this. It just looks very, very dangerous. With the king driven there, apparently knight d3. This is looking very, very strong. But anyway, bishop h6 wasn't played. It's a very, very quick way of transferring potentially the queen around the king side, the queen side here. So we see instead another annoying move though in Kramnik's words. He said something very interesting about not just trying to play the best moves, but trying to play the most annoying moves in his opponent's time pressure. Queen g4 is annoying because it has this idea as well, just maybe not as elegantly as bishop h6, which cut down the f file and gave that immediately. Queen g4 is a nice move as well. So he's suspending the idea of taking on c6 in all this. Knight d5, and now he takes on c6. And there's another idea that has emerged now, this pin of this knight against the king on the diagonal. So rook e6, check, king a8, queen e4, that pin there is quite nasty. Rook b6, and interestingly now, sometimes we consider about parrying the opponent's immediate threats in advance. Black is not immediately threatening something, but in two moves might be threatening to dislodge now white's queen from beautiful central location if black is allowed to play rook b5 and queen f5. And this is another annoying move which maybe has some downside as a target. Vladimir plays g4, so in advance of rook b5 and queen f5. But is this a target for the h file to undermine this? That's tested now with h5, which might not have been actually the best reaction. In this position, g4 is not even given by the engines as a particularly good move, so maybe it is in the annoying category, g4, rather than the best move category. Apparently even just rook c5, it looks fairly direct, is possible here. White's back row is protected at the moment. What will black do here? For example, c6, knight takes c6, and black would appear to be crumbling. That d5 is crumbling. That sorts out the back row, and after taking on d5, this doesn't look to be a problem. Taking on this, it doesn't seem to backfire that much. White could be quite pleasantly placed here. The exchange down, but with these central rolling pawns. But no, this annoying move g4 isn't too bad either. In advance of rook b5 and queen f5, taking away the f5 square, it still gives white a technical advantage, but a little bit reduced from rook c5. So okay, it's an interesting concept to play annoying moves rather than best moves, but we're trying to win in chess, and I think annoying the opponent, if that causes psychological frustration and blunders, then you tend to win more games than maybe otherwise. So okay, so h5 did seem to be a fairly logical response, but this is actually now not great apparently, because white just ignores g4 and just plays rook c5. Perhaps better rook d8, just supporting the knight, and then h5. For example here, this apparently black could be quite stubborn in this position. But anyway, so h5 immediately, rook c5, and the problem now, after rook d8, knight c6 is a real pest. Black felt compelled to snap this off. If he doesn't snap off the knight, say rook d7, then e6, ouch. And that pawn, is going to, queen here. It doesn't matter about taking on e4. So that's pretty nasty. So what else can black do about d5? So he takes on c6. So now not even the exchange down, but he's winning this g pawn. But again, it's double pawns. Again, this game features a lot of these double pawns dynamically being allowed. Rook f6, nice move, attacking the queen. Where can the queen go? there's not too many nice options. The queen actually went to h7 here. Okay, the rook is holding up d5, so you might think this is okay, but now e6 apparently is very strong in this position. This would have been very it's seemingly simple and strong, actually, with white now threatening all sorts of things like rook f7, but Vladimir chose another good move, bishop g5. So now trying to undermine the defender of the d5 knight, quite painful move to meet. Queen g8 was played, and now rook takes g6, hitting the rook and the queen. I think black was in severe time trouble. It's collapsed, he's totally collapsed here, and he resigned. He's just losing tons of material now. So say queen e8, we'll just take this, and then we're left this horrible pin. So here, anything really, e6 is good enough. So yeah, bit of a collapse for black at the end. So I found this game quite fascinating from the opening innovation. I would say it's like an opening innovation, this, where 91 games apparently in Livebook had e takes f6 before. If we go back to this position here, quite incredible. But from an engine perspective, this is a viable candidate move, even though it might not have been played before in Livebook. 93 games with e takes, only one here I see with a3, but from an engine view, a3 is a good candidate move here. Very interesting if this sets off a trend for this being popular, this particular game with a3. I think the whole idea of letting black have seemingly good control of d5, not being any rush to actually regain the pawn on e4, and using the a file not for a7 but to sacrifice the exchange later, I think the whole thing's quite beautiful. There's a beautiful dynamic feel to this particular game. I hope you enjoyed it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.